Welcome to the MTA International Studios in Silver Spring, Maryland, USA. Today we will be talking about the spiritual recession, democracy, communism, and a fascinating article by the columnist in the New York Times, David Brooks. We have three great panelists here with us today. Starting on my right is Imam Hamad Ahmed, who's an imam in the Baltimore area, as well as an avid fan of sports. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And next we have Amjad Khan, who's a practicing lawyer in Los Angeles, California, as well as the Director of Public Relations for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And third, we have author Daniel Spiro, who is the author of various books, including Liberating the Holy Name, God. Welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
So, Amjad, can you contextualize this for us? There was a great article written by the columnist David Brooks. What's his thesis? What, democracy, socialism? What are we talking about here?
So David Brooks is a very thoughtful writer. He wrote a very thoughtful piece. It's focused on this notion of a spiritual recession. The idea is that America stood for a certain high-minded idea of democracy, what he calls, this universal democracy, and our nation was founded in exporting this concept that having representative form of government, being fearful of the tyranny of the majority, making sure there's minority protections, capitalism, all of these very important concepts that are quintessentially democratic are what galvanized a country towards responding to other countries. So we all, as Americans, believed in this democracy. But he says that there's a recession now. What he means by that is there used to be a war between democracy and socialism in the Cold War, and democracy won. But now, in the last several decades, many Americans are losing hope in this notion of democracy, and now this high-mindedness that drove a nation is eroding. And he's wondering, what does that mean? What are the implications for our society when we no longer believe in the very ideal we want to export?
That's a great explanation. Daniel, so tell me about democracy. What are those ideals and how could they erode? I mean, we won, right?
Well, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And I think that, I'm a strong believer in democracy. I'm a strong believer in the so-called principles of Jefferson. And I think America is great, and it was great because we've had democracy before in Athens. We've had representative government in places like Athens and Venice. But with America, we had it on a large scale. And I do think that most people in the world appreciate the principles of democracy, but it's not a cure-all. I think we're living in a polarized time, and we're living in a divisive time. And democracy alone cannot solve all these problems.
But what can it solve? What is democracy?
Well,
is this representative government? What are the other elements of it?
I mean, you need to have
what's so good about it?
Law and order. You need to have representative government, I think, of different branches. You need to have separation of powers. And yes, you do need to listen to the voices of as many people as possible. When minority rights are being violated, you need to do something about that. You don't have that in other forms of government. So that's why those of us who recognize the problems of democracy and the limitations of democracy still say it's preferable to all the alternatives.
And speaking of alternatives, Imam Hamad, there's democracy, there's socialism. We're contending democracy beats socialism. Where does Islam fall in all this?
Interestingly, Amjad Saab, he mentioned democracy versus socialism. And I don't look at it as democracy versus socialism. I don't see these two things as opposed to each other. I see democracy as a system form of government. Socialism can be the form or the system or the economic system that we can run. And Islam teaches democracy as a form of government. Islam doesn't teach, autocratic government, doesn't teach dictatorship. It teaches democracy. It teaches, representation of people. It teaches voting of the people. In an economic system, it teaches socialism. It doesn't teach communism that everyone's equal, no one can progress, but it teaches socialism and that everyone gets a share of the resources that are there from the earth. And so I don't see both of them at war with each other. I want to kind of challenge that assumption that they both are opposites. I agree with Daniel when he said that, democracy solves some problems, but it doesn't solve everything. Yeah, it does solve problems when it comes to how to run government, but I think some elements of socialism must be incorporated into it, and that makes one whole unified system. And that would be the complete system that Islam teaches, a democratic socialism.
So if democracy is so great, I mean, it beat socialism or some form of socialism, it's doing so well, why would it be eroding? If we've won and this is the form that works, what's eroding about it? What are we missing?
Because what's driving our exportation of democracy is war. And so there's an inherent contradiction that when you are driving a foreign policy, and this is not, I'm not trying to generalize here, but in specific instances, for example, the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan, protracted wars with new enemies that aren't states, but shadow groups, then you're still fighting within the rubric of defending this ideal. But if you're trying to export this concept in contexts that are very difficult to adopt these democratic principles, for example, in Egypt, there was an autocratic ruler, and then there was the Arab Spring, and so the idea of the hope from the U.S. that there will be a democratic replacement, but it's not that easy. It's not that simple. So every context, every political system, the economic, social, and political mores of that society, which are sometimes informed by religion, but not always informed by religion, they can't always be conducive to democracy. What I agree with Brooks about is this high-mindedness of the United States. He quotes the poet Walt Whitman, a famous American poet. He talks about democratic vistas. This notion that we are better together as a collective, we should fight for something bigger than what you and I stand for, or individual choices, that's what shapes a group identity. I believe in that, but I think he puts too much faith in the notion of democracy, but I accept his view that we need a certain virtue as a society to rally around. What he talks about is libertarianism. Libertarianism is this rugged individual, preoccupation with your own choices. And he says libertarianism is actually now replacing or confronting or assaulting democracy or democratic high-mindedness. That's the recession we're in. That now libertarianism has come in and people are more concerned with choices and they don't care about the collective U.S. democratic experiment.
So Daniel, in America, let's put the nation building in other countries aside for a second. In America, what are we practicing today?
Well, I would call this a capitalist democracy, which has some amount of, it has a relatively big government, not relative to the rest of the world, but relative to what we've seen in earlier eras. And so... Big government is not good? No, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it's what we're practicing today.
To democracy.
I agree with the Imam. I think that democracy is a type of government and approach to government, and then we have capitalism and socialism and feudalism or whatever, and those are different economic systems. Sure. And so we have a mixed society right now because we have some amount of government in a primarily capitalist economy, and we have a democratic governance structure which doesn't completely work. And I look at what happened in 2008, where we had hope and change, and everybody fell in love with this message that our current president was selling. But then when he came to power, a lot of people said, well, let's see if we can make him not that effective by fighting him. And then all of a sudden we had two sides. And you had people for him and you had people against him, and it became polarized, and then it shut down.
Isn't that the great thing about the democracy, leaving the capitalism out for a second, but just the democracy part, there are two sides and you come to a better answer?
It is great that we have diversity of opinion, and it is great that we have freedom of expression and freedom of the press. But you need a certain amount of unification and spirit to accomplish great things. So for example, if you take climate change as a big problem, and I do, how are we going to fight the scourge of climate change? Well, when you have a polarized environment where if one side says, let's fight it, the other side must react and say, let's not, you can't get anything accomplished. And I think that's a problem with our democracy today. But it's not a problem inherent in democracy. It's a problem with our particular society today. And I do think it has to do with the spiritual recession that we're having. We're sort of like fat cats. We've been affluent for so long. There's nothing really that impels us to keep fighting. We're not lean and hungry.
So let me get this. So we are becoming more capitalistic, and We are in our democracy, we're fighting for the sake of fighting, taking the opposing view in our American democracy. And the root cause of that is this spiritual recession where people aren't inclined towards a God.
Well, I don't think it's spiritual in the sense of godlessness. I think David Brooks would characterize it as this kind of biblical sense of morality, which he calls this kind of basic sense. Some of it's grounded in religion, but I think he's speaking more of believing in something bigger than yourself, right? But I do agree that there is the religion is on the defensive now and is on the ropes, and there is growing atheism, and there is a confrontation of this notion of that religion can guide democratic principles. In its place, there is this view that no, things could be relative. And we don't always have to export our point of view to the other side. I mean, the poster child of the libertarian philosophy is Ron Paul. He ran for president, and he believes in this notion that we should essentially, effectively, close our borders and focus on the home front, right? That's the libertarian, that's the political manifestation of a libertarian philosophy. What I think is contributing to it, and I agree with Daniel, is also this, it's not so much that we're more capitalistic, it's that the income inequality, and the fact that there is such an amass of wealth and so few that it's not really a democracy, it's a plutocracy. Government by the wealthy. And people who aren't wealthy are somehow lost in that mix, and then you lose your spirituality in that sense.
But in our democracy, if you work hard, you have a fair shake at that opportunity, and those that have worked hard for their money have made it. Why are you against them? Well,
that presupposes that everyone has the equal opportunity, but we know that there are a lot of disaffected and discriminated minorities who've never had that chance or opportunity. We also know that there are a lot of tax incentives and tax breaks and government policies that have allowed the rich to get richer. I mean, Warren Buffett complains that his housekeeper has a higher tax bracket than he does. That's not because... And he believes in capitalism and he's benefited from it, but it's the laws that have created his wealth.
So our capitalistic democracy, as Daniel described it, is a democracy that's creating this 1%, the 99%, and a spiritual recession. And what's good about it?
I don't think it's very good at all. I'm very, very worried about it. I think all Americans should be worried about the fact that without a spiritual idea, without something about virtue and what, Alexis de Tocqueville, a famous philosopher and commentator who viewed the United States in the 19th century, commented, something bigger in America is happening. This virtue that exists, associations and like-mindedness and this idealism, it's seeping away. We need to galvanize around something that's bigger than us. We can't do that when there's so much income inequality, when there's so much discrimination, and the laws are actually favoring one group or the other, or even things like racism that are happening currently in the United States, which is a polarizing society. So I think there's nothing good about this. I think the spiritual recession is real, and I think this is true in history. It's not a new phenomenon, but I think that we need to build spirituality as people of faith or no faith into the system.
So Daniel, you wrote a book, Liberating the Holy Name God. Tell us about your book and how it relates to this.
Liberating the Holy Name is a book that tries to make religion a unifying force and not a divisive force. I look at the name God as having a denotation and a connotation. What it denotes is the ultimate. So when people say his God is money and her God is power, they mean that's what the ultimate concern is for that person, and that's the ultimate concern for that person. But we also say those are false gods, because we all know that money and power are not the ultimate. But it also has a connotation. And the connotation that most people have for God is the biblical God, the omnipotent, omnibenevolent, etc., etc. And to me, if we could start talking about God based on God's denotation, the ultimate, which is mostly a mystery, which is about mostly infinity, right? Not just what we know about, then we can all come together in a search for God, in a search for loving God, but never being able to really capture fully the meaning of God. And we can work together individually and collectively in this search. But as long as we keep talking about God as, my God has these qualities and your God has those qualities, we immediately divide and start fighting with each other.
So then are you suggesting that if there are three people in a room who are of three different faiths, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, as opposed to talking about their faith and how their faith promotes peace or democracy or other things, they should bubble up and talk about God in general?
I'm saying that as an interfaith activist, we need to focus on both our common ground and what divides us. We need to recognize that we are all part of the same family. The groups that you're talking about, frankly, we call ourselves first cousins in the Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society of Washington. We're really close family members in the family of Abraham. And the fact that we believe in one God and we believe in this notion of the ultimate is so profound, and we do need to spend time talking about that. We have many of the same principles that we believe in, and we need to spend time talking about that. But we also have differences. And once we realize that we're family, then those differences can be things we can play with, that we can embrace, that we can learn from. I can become a better Jew because I have read the Quran, and I can take Quranic principles and inspire my Judaism with them.
Interesting.
So I think you need to do both.
Okay. Imam Ahmad, you're a Muslim leader. You've traveled the country in talking about Islam in general. Do you disagree with Daniel?
I agree with that completely. What he's speaking about is a Quranic principle. The Quran says that it says, say to the people of the book, come to a word equal between us, between me and you, that we worship none but that one God. So what he's saying about starting with that common ground, talk about God, that is the starting point. It's a common psychological point that when you start and with an agreement, you get along with each other. Once I ask you a question, you say yes, we're going to get along with each other. We'll have that rapport, we'll have a productive conversation. So if all people of faith can come together and talk about God together, we're starting off with positivity. We're starting off by saying yes to each other. We can start with that productive conversation. Then obviously, of course, we can delve into our differences, but we can delve into those understanding that we agree to disagree on certain points.
Isn't that just playing with words? We're going to start, get along for a little bit, and then we'll talk about, isn't that just an order thing versus we're really going to get to the crux of the matter?
But it's psychology. If we start off, if I ask you a question and you immediately disagree with you, I'm going to look at you from that perspective that this person disagrees with the things I think. And psychologically speaking, I will approach you with that negativity. You will approach me with that negativity, and that negativity will be in our relationship. But if we start off with a certain type of positivity, then that positivity is what starts our relationship off. And even when we head into negative grounds, there's a positivity that surrounds it. There's a certain energy that helps us get along.
Okay. So Amjad, so you've heard these two folks agreeing. They're of seemingly opposing religions, Judaism and Islam, but yet they're coming together and they're agreeing we should talk about God. But in context of the spiritual recession in America, people going away from religion in general, is this the antidote that's going to help them bring them closer to religion by bringing them closer to God?
I think that often when you talk among groups who are those who don't subscribe to any religion, let's say they're atheist or agnostic, and you bring up religion, that tends to be that tends to end the conversation. It doesn't continue the conversation, unfortunately. It's not always the case, but that happens frequently in this heightened era of sensitivities. And so what I would surmise a better approach would be that there are certain principles of our democracy, the United States democracy, a flawed democracy, no doubt, but there are certain principles that we all believe in as Americans. Those principles that are founded in the U.S. Constitution have synergies with all faith traditions, and they have synergies with people who are just spiritual but perhaps not religious. We all could unite on those principles. When this country was founded, there was a lot of unity towards George Washington. Abraham Lincoln brought this country together. These individuals who are our founding fathers were not necessarily particularly religious. Now, there's a debate over that, but there's some good, hard evidence that they were not particularly religious in many ways, but they believed in these ideals that had harmony with religion. We need to speak and come together on ideas that can unite us. I do believe that the power to unite is stronger than the power that divides, but it doesn't always have to be grounded in theological concepts and concepts of whether there's a God or not, or these fundamental questions questions that will inherently create debate. It could be much different than that. Let's focus on the principles of our country that made us great, and let's go back to them.
But does this go against the notion? I mean, one of the great things about the democracy here that may not exist in America, that may not exist in other countries, is this idea of separation of church and state, this idea of freedom of religion. There are countries where it just doesn't exist. And that most of us would agree is a good thing. But yet we're saying the way we practice day to day is driving people away from religion.
Thomas Jefferson famously said that the wall of separation between religion and state, he called it. The concept of separation of church and state is not in the Constitution, but he said famously that it strengthens both religion and state when you separate. So that principle is absolutely important for us to
Daniel, how
carry that
does
debate.
it strengthen that? I mean, your book in bringing God back, will it strengthen that?
Look, I am what you call a born-again Jew. I came to believe in God in a Jerusalem Orthodox yeshiva, even though I am not an Orthodox Jew. But I come from a background of Marxist atheists, right? My family dating back. And these were people who I think, even I would say, are godless. I mean, they don't believe in God. But they were religious. They had a passion for social uplift. They had a passion for helping poor people. Even when they became affluent themselves, and most of them became professors and other types of professionals, they cared deeply about economic inequality. I believe in the separation of church and state because I don't think it does anybody any good to have an alternative to that, right? I believe in intellectual freedom and the freedom to practice whatever faith you want to. But I do believe that there is a deep spiritual recession in this country today. And it's more than just about God or no God. It's about a group of people right now who just don't care. They are spiritually apathetic. And all they care about are their own little hobbies like sports and getting their kids into Harvard. And, or just buying the next gadget. And this is really destroying the fabric of our country.
So and Harvard's not a bad place, but I see what you mean.
No, I mean, both of us went there, for example.
So
it's not the goal in life, though, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So understanding the challenges, right, and understanding, this income inequality, some of the challenges that the American capitalistic democracy that has created, and the spiritual recession. Let's move to the solutions. How can we bring individuals of any faith or no faith at all towards God? Or is the goal to bring them towards their Creator? And is the assumption, well, let's talk about that first, then we can talk about is the assumption if we do that, we'll be able to cure some of these other challenges that we're talking about. Imam Hamad?
As the Ahmadiyya Muslim community and as our Imam Hazrat Khalifatul Masih has spoken very clearly that the solution to the problems of the world lies in coming back to recognizing our Creator. It comes back to recognizing a sense of absolute justice. We can all sit here and espouse our own ideals of I think this is right, I think this is wrong, I think democracy is right for this reason, I think this type of democracy is good. We can all sit here and talk about these things, but when it comes down to it, we need an absolute sense of what is right, what is wrong. That can only come from our Creator. That can only come from a being who is outside of us, who is greater than us, who looks at all of us equally. And that we can only reach that sense of absolute justice by reaching that absolute Creator, by reaching that God. And it is Him who decides or ordains what is right, what is wrong.
And that does not necessarily have to be the path to that is not owned by Islam?
That path to that is not owned by Islam at all. Islam doesn't say that it owns that path. It says it gives you the shortest path to God, but it's not owned by Islam. Islam says wherever you find truth, pick it up anywhere you get it from.
Daniel, what are the solutions from a Jewish perspective?
Well, what I can tell you is that it's important to distinguish between God and the name. God is primarily a mystery. God is infinite. God is eternal. For everything we know about God, there are an infinite number of things we don't. We belong to God, but the name belongs to us. It's a word in our heads. Mm-hmm. And we need to start grappling with that. We need to be free thinkers, searching for truth with respect to that name. And we need to talk about that name with each other in a non-threatening way and say, let's embrace this search together, rather than saying, I'm right and you're wrong. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense of open-mindedness that we need. But we also need to realize that faith and religion is as indispensable as the love of science, the love of history, the love of music, the love of literature. And when people say, I don't need God, what I say is, no, you only need like water. You don't even need food. But why would you want to live without this sense of the ultimate?
But bring
why
me
would you want it?
But bring me towards the spiritual recession, though. I mean, what do we do about that?
Concrete suggestion. Every church, synagogue, mosque, etc., needs to have a twin, so that people, when they go to their masjid, will also have, say, a synagogue that they go to periodically that gets together. Really doesn't matter if it's Jewish Islamic, Jewish Christian, whatever. But we need to be embracing the interfaith movement so that we don't just spend time with our own kind.
How does the interfaith community come together to do this? There's disagreements in the interfaith community as well. How do they come together, and what are the principles that they need to practice?
I think they should focus on low-hanging fruit. You know, as I mentioned earlier, the common vocabulary should be one of humanity. You know, the notion that you know your creator. There's in the Quran, you need to love your creation. You know your creator if you love your creation. So whether you believe in God or not, that creator, and many people in the United States don't, there is a sense among people who are of no faith or who have faith that there is a pursuit towards a better humanity. That means that the transformative power of faith should not be undermined or belittled. And those who don't believe in faith should not be belittled or undermined as well. If you build common projects that transcend ideological differences but focus on the betterment of humanity, whether that's income inequality, climate change, these meta issues, racism, things that we can as a society, you know, retrieve that high-mindedness that defined us, that's been lost, that's what we should focus on. We do it, I agree, in an interfaith context. We do it when we do humanitarian work, we do blood drives, we do soup kitchen drives, when we talk about how we can not redistribute wealth, but make it more accessible, make the economy more accessible for everyone. And I think these concepts are not grounded in religion. The moment they become grounded in religion, unfortunately, a lot of people view it as a toxic issue, and they start belittling religion. I think people of faith should realize that their transformative power lies in common humanity.
But who are these leaders that can lead this effort? I mean, in the interfaith community or otherwise. I know the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, His Holiness is in England. They've got an international community. The Catholic Church has an international community that is. Who are these leaders in America that can take a leadership role in this?
You know, every local cleric is responsible. I mean, I'm not a local cleric. I'm a writer. I do many things. I wear many hats, but my daughter's in rabbinical school. I'm not. And yet I feel compelled to get involved in this.
Every local leader, who can come together?
I think that you have to, I agree, you have to have political leaders, you have to have thought leaders, you have to have academics, you have to have civic association leaders, you have to have faith leaders from the local, the regional, the state, and the federal level. And Americans have lost faith in their governmental leaders. So the governmental leaders need to realize that if they come together on issues that all Americans agree on, where the approval ratings or the polls suggest 80% of people want something done on immigration or climate change, then solutions need to be done. But the moment that solutions are not crafted in a bipartisan way, America suffers. Going back to Brooks's thesis, we're in a spiritual recession because there's a lack of compromise. And this lack of compromise has happened in U.S. history, but it's at a toxic, unsustainable level. We can't sustain our own virtues as a country if we can't come along and agree, for example, to raise the debt ceiling or something that's very trivial to do.
Thank you. Well, and we're unfortunately out of time. This was a fascinating conversation. Thank you for being here. We learned about many things, and hopefully your solutions can address the spiritual recession in America. Thank you for joining us at MTA International at our studios in Silver Spring, Maryland.